conditions. Well, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, vowed to renew Britain as she laid out the government's spending review yesterday, announcing funding boosts to sectors such as healthcare and defence. Breaking it down by sector, the Chancellor announced defence spending will rise to 2.6% of GDP by 2027. And those of you who are joining up the dots will notice that is dramatically lower than what the US administration is calling for ahead of that key NATO meeting in just a few days' time. Anyway, 2.6% by 2027. An increase on Prime Minister Keir Starmer's pledge earlier this month amidst pressure from NATO allies. Reeves also announced what she called a record cash investment into the NHS, with an extra £29 billion annually on its day-to-day running for each year of the spending review. And the government's pledge to build more homes across the United Kingdom. £39 billion was allocated to social and affordable housing over the next decade. But not all sectors stand to benefit from the review, with day-to-day spending on the Departments of Transport and Environment set to fall, along with both the Home Office and indeed the Foreign Office. During her address to Parliament, Reeves laid out the reasoning behind the move to prioritise defence spending.
The world is changing before our eyes. And since the spring, the challenges that we face have become even more acute. The signs of our age of insecurity are everywhere. So we are acting on the promise in our plan to change, building renewal on foundations of national security, border security and economic security. As the Prime Minister said earlier this month, a new era in the threats that we face demands a new era for defence and security. That's why we took the decision to prioritise our defence spending by reducing overseas development aid, so that defence spending will now rise to 2.6% of GDP by April 2027, including the contribution of our intelligence agency.
Well, let's get a very important view on this with Mel Stride, who I'm sure you're all aware is the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Mel, thank you very much indeed for joining CNBC today. Look, unlike me, I'm sure you've read most of the 138-page tome, so you could get into the weeds that we didn't get into in Parliament yesterday. There's a lot to play for, and of course, the growth that Rachel Reeves thinks will turn up later in the Parliament as well. Do you believe that this spending review plus her budget past and budget future can deliver that growth?
Well, all the evidence so far is definitely not. I think of the spending review, you have to ask a couple of questions. One is, where is the money coming from? And where it's been coming from is huge taxes. You mentioned national insurance, that's £25 billion worth of taxes on businesses that has been destroying growth, and a huge amount of borrowing. Now, that borrowing is having consequences in terms of higher inflation in the UK than would otherwise be the case, and therefore interest rates higher for longer. And it's adding to the debt mountain, the servicing costs upon which are running at £100 billion a year. That's twice what we spend on defence. So I'm afraid the overall economy is in a very weak position to withstand the kind of spending and borrowing that this government is announcing.
But with respect, Mel, at the moment, the pound is pretty steady. The bond markets are pretty steady, and neither of which we could say are after the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng budget as well. And I know you've said that that was a mistake, the way that was handled as well, and its relationship with the markets as well. But having said that, if growth can be delivered, and there are enormous numbers of infrastructure initiatives which the government has talked about as well, which they said will drive that growth, then this will be a recipe for longer-term growth, won't it?
Well, no, not if you're building an economy on a very fragile basis. So we've just seen the GDP figures out in the last hour for April, which with the economy shrank by 0.3%. That's far worse than most economists were expecting. Look, if you go back to the budget from last year, the Chancellor had some fiscal headroom against her fiscal targets there. All of that was blown and more. She rebuilt it in the spring, but most economists feel that that will have evaporated and more come the autumn, when she'll probably, almost certainly actually, have to come back with even more tax increases, which in turn, of course, will be a dampener on the economy. So we've ended up in a very fragile situation, particularly when you've got the tariffs around the world. She'll probably have to, at some point, look at maybe spending more on defence, which is not baked into the numbers at the moment. She's done a U-turn on means testing winter fuel payments. That's over £1 billion. That has not been accounted for or funded for. These are all pressures which, given the way they've mismanaged the economy, I'm afraid are going to be very, very difficult indeed.
Mel, good morning. Juliana here. The Tories were in power for 14 years here, and the Labour Party would say that we're in this fragile situation here as a result of years of austerity and underinvestment by the Conservative Party. What's your response to that criticism?
So I think in recent years of the 14 that you mentioned, I mean, we had a terrible inheritance in 2010 with a deficit that was over 10% of the size of the economy, and we had to get that down. But we also, of course, had COVID that shrank the UK economy by over 10% overnight, and we had to preserve jobs by intervening in the labour market, which was a huge amount of money we spent doing that. And also we had the Ukraine-Russia war, which imported, as it did into other countries, very high levels of inflation that we got down through time, and we had to support people with cost of living payments so that we didn't have mass poverty in our country. All of those things cost a lot of money and added to the debt and added to our tax burden. But we were turning a corner. On the day of the general election, in fact, we had inflation down to bang on its target at 2%. It's almost double that now. We had near record level of employment, near record low level of unemployment, and we'd seen real wages increasing for each of 13 consecutive months up to the day of the general election. So things had turned the corner. It hasn't taken this government long to reverse all that, I'm afraid, and you're seeing that in the terrible growth figures that we've just had in the last hour.
When it comes to the threat that I think both the Conservatives and the Labour Party are facing, it seems like that's actually coming from Reform UK and Nigel Farage. Reform UK having a 7-point lead at this stage over Labour in the polls. To what extent do you think Reeves's measures were designed to try to regain lost ground from Reform UK? And how is the Conservative Party attempting to craft their case against Reform UK?
OK, so the first thing I think is we're 4.5 years from a general election. The polls are going to move around. It's very difficult to know where we'll be in some years to come, and the only poll that will matter will be the next general election poll. But to your point, look, I think Reform have benefited from the fact that it's certainly the case we had a very, very punishing general election result, and there were many reasons for that. It will take us time to rebuild from that position, but we are actively very much working on that at the moment. And the Labour Party is in a complete mess and is messing up the economy. And in that scenario, of course, being none of the above, it creates a vacuum which Reform have jumped into and taken that position. What we've got to do really with Reform is to shine a light of truth on what their policies really amount to. And in the economic space, they are a complete economic fantasy. This is fantasy economics, this idea that you could drop taxes left, right and centre, multiple tens of billions, not worry about how you're going to fund it. Those are the kind of mistakes that we have seen in the past, and we all know where that leads. So there's a long way to go to the next general election, but those are the kind of arguments that we've got to be putting.
I think we've got time to squeeze one more in, Mel, as well. Look, a deal with the extraordinary acronym, the CPTPP, a deal with the Americans, a deal with Europe, a deal with India. These are good things, though. You must think they are positive in terms of galvanising growth with fast-moving parts of the world.
Well, CPTPP, absolutely. That is a fast-growing part of the world, and that was a trade deal that was concluded when we were in office. I mean, you mentioned the United States there. There's no deal that's been signed at all, and it's still been moving around all over the place as to what the tariffs are we're going to be facing with our cars, and in particular steel products. So, you know, great, a deal is a deal if it's signed on the line and it can hold, but we're under this government, I'm afraid, we certainly haven't achieved that position with the United States.